welcome guests, all of you. I'm very grateful to you for all of you for accepting our invitation to be here along with ORF. This is now Minister Sir and all distinguished guests who are speaking. This is now an important session for our calendar. This has now become an annual exercise. This is the second time that we are hosting here, and it becomes a useful forum to put out India's point of view, India's perspective, bring this outreach to all distinguished guests who are here. And of course, we heard our minister also explain yesterday that India is the bridge between the north and the south, east and the west, and we look forward, sir, to a very interesting discussion. Once again, welcome to all of you, and we hope to have you and organize this along with ORF in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So I'll jump into the conversation straight off. This conversation, of course, is for me, in many ways, not planned to be one, but is certainly now, in many ways, appearing to be the curtain raiser for the Raisina dialogue that kicks off on the 21st evening in New Delhi, where many of you will be flying from here. And there was a demand, sir, that we should have a German-India charter plane between Munich Security Conference and Raisina. So that's something the Ministry of External Affairs can consider. But as a curtain raiser, what I'm going to try and do today is to try and get from these very fine minds and leaders in their countries, ways in which we can partner together, ways to get around this moment where everything seems to be so polarized and so fractured, and to try and come up with real solutions because lives are at stake. And in many ways, this is a conversation for bridging the gap, bridging divides, for seeing this moment as one which could be transformational in creating new architectures and frameworks. And I can see Jane here, a report that she and I produced for the World Economic Forum, where we again tried to put together our minds on finding partnerships and institutions and relationships that would really work. But before we get to the solutions, let me try and ask Megan to frame the challenge. In many ways, are we doomed as the global north, global south, east and west, and every label that you can pick, are we doomed to be divided now? Or are there sufficient drivers to put us back together and to knock heads and find solutions? What are the drivers that are pulling us apart? And what could be the forces that could pull us together? And Megan, let me start with you.
Great. Samir, let me thank you for having us, and thanks to the Observer Research Foundation. That is a big question, but I'll try to address it succinctly. First, I think, we have always had discord within the international system. So to suggest that this is a moment that departs differently from the past, I think is debatable. But there's a couple of reasons why I would say this moment feels particularly salient and why the divisions feel so significant. The first is because there is what I think of as a mismatch between global problems and global capabilities. So the global problems are intensifying, and those are climate change or security problems, pandemics, those types of things. They're global in nature, they transcend boundaries, and by definition, we would think the best way to deal with them would be through global institutions and global cooperation. But the mismatch is we increasingly are faced with those kinds of problems, yet our global institutions aren't working so well because the big factor in the international system is really great power competition. So we've got great power competition, which is undermining the effectiveness of our institutions, our global institutions, but we have global problems. The second issue, I think, has to do with the fact that we're in a transition. The liberal international order, I think, is, being transformed, is moving into something else, something more multipolar in nature, but we're not really there yet. And there are a number of different dimensions to the order that is emerging. One is the great power competition that I talked about, that we're all keenly aware of. But then there's also this rise of what many of us call middle powers, which are countries that are not interested in being aligned with one side or the other, but really interested in maximizing their own autonomy and maximizing maximizing the opportunities in the international system. And so we have a lot of competing dimensions here. In terms of, do I have hope that we can find ways to work together? I think none of us would be here if we didn't have hope. You have to be optimistic that we can come together and address some of these global problems. And I think ultimately, things that are dividing us now will need to be the things that bring us together. And the best example may be climate change.
So Megan, quick question, follow up. Liberal international order, or basically the West-led order, as we knew it, is giving way to something new. Powers are rising who want their space in that new system. Is that a bad thing?
Well, I think it depends on where you sit, of course. Not everyone is going to see it the same way. As an American, as the only American up here, I would say there are both challenges and opportunities associated with that. There's the challenge that obviously you have new countries that have more weight in the international system that are not interested in making these permanent alliances or alignments. And they have scope to really, exert and demand concessions and incentives and those types of things that could be exacerbating to this great power conflict that I talked about. The opportunity is, these countries are not looking to build permanent coalitions with, in my case, with America's adversaries. And so that creates opportunities for cooperation. So I think, there's some of both a challenge and an opportunity associated with it.
Prince Faisal, let me turn to you. I think that's a good point of departure for you to come in. Rise of new powers. I'm sure many of them may not want to be referred to as middle powers. But say the rise of new powers, and what does that do to the international system? What does that do to your region?
I'll agree with Megan. It offers challenges, but I think it offers significantly more opportunities because it means that you have more countries, first of all, that are growing economically, so that are contributing to the economic well-being of the global community of nations. But you also have countries that are growing in capacity and ability to help manage the security affairs of their immediate abroad, as long as you include them, as long as you make them part of this new multipolar system. As as long as we develop a fair playing field for everyone, you have then a network of capable countries that can contribute to a much more stable, much more secure, much more prosperous future. As an example, this is something we are trying to do, with Vision 2030, which is not just about our own economic development, but very much setting an example for the region towards a much better future focused on cooperation, development, and security. So I think the opportunities certainly far outweigh the challenges, as long as I think we work on accepting that that's the reality that we're moving into.
Prince, I want to also ask you a follow-up. There is a big question mark on what is the strength of the coalition of these new middle powers that seem to be cooperating and coordinating on a number of issues. What binds them? People use the term global south, for example, but is there a rule book for the global south? Is there articles of association for the global south? What constitutes the global south?
It's hard to say what constitutes the global south, because that's something that's changing very much. And, even calling it the global south, I think, is a term that many countries reject, because there are countries that are not part of the south that are also seeing themselves in that coalition. And I think what binds them is a real belief that they can make their own way, that they don't need to be dependent on one party or other in the world in order to forge a better future for themselves and their neighbors. And through that, they are developing mechanisms of cooperation with each other and, of course, with their traditional partners for the kingdom. For instance, we're working very closely with the US. We're also working with China. We're working with India. But we are looking for our own path to a secure future, to a stable future, to our place within the global system, especially in regards to economic growth. And I think, again, that will offer significant opportunities, especially in meeting many of the challenges. Climate change is one of them, but there are many others that working together with a multitude of ideas, and approaches that will, I think, contribute to a much, much more inclusive future for everyone.
Vice President Vestager, let me turn to you. Some would argue that technology domain generally has been peak globalization. It's where all of us were connected at speeds and scale as never before. Some would also argue that's where globalization hit a roadblock, and we actually started seeing the pushback against globalization, both from an economic perspective, but also political ideologies, radical movements, irrational mobilizations. You see all of it play out in the digital domain. Is the world beginning to cooperate on managing a digital future?
A resounding yes and no. Because we are...
The yes was louder.
Yeah, but we are in some degrees. First, I think this is a very interesting discussion about what happens to what we consider world order. Because I think it's really important to realize that nobody wants to be recruited. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants to forge their own way, while at the same time also realizing that everybody needs someone else in order to be able to deliver. Mm-hmm. There's no way that we can deliver fighting climate change without everyone on board. There's no way that we can uphold the UN Charter if we do not everyone come on board. So I think, for me, it's a positive that we're moving into a different direction. And I think also when it comes to technology, there are different ways, but they are, to some degree, technology is still a great equalizer. Mm-hmm. We can achieve amazing things. I think India is the prime example of that. What has been achieved with the Aadhaar system, both during the pandemic, but definitely before, with identity, with monetary transfers, with the digitization of services from the Indian state. I think that shows the potential of providing public services where it would otherwise not be possible. Mm-hmm. And if we insist on enabling people to connect, mm-hmm. and here we have a real digital divide, we have a lot of work ahead of us to enable people to get the benefits of connectivity, then I think we can make a big push for every country in coalition with others to forge a better past. Of course, the underlying condition here, and that is the now, is that we need to get better at harnessing the negative side of technology. They are many and they are obvious, but the potential in doing so is enormous. Because if you trust technology, if you trust that when a government uses technology, it is for you good, you're not being misused, you're not the product, your data is safe, then the uptake is much, much faster. And here, I think globally we have taken steps. They're not sufficient yet. I just asked that maybe I could be allowed to pick your brain later on how you think about AI, because we have the G7 Code of Conduct, but India, Indonesia, Brazil was invited partners last year, so being part of the discussion. We have the presidential order in the US. We have the AI Act of the European Union, which has now also politically been fully passed. So we are getting there, but we are not there yet. And in order to unleash the potential, we need connectivity and we need to harness the dark side of technology.
Vice President, you were also not particularly popular in Silicon Valley at some point. I don't know, it may have changed recently.
It was not my mission.
You had an interesting relationship, let me just put it this way, it was interesting. But let me just take this further now. In the age of AI, and since you raised the point of AI, one of the worries in many parts of the world is that this is again going to be a revolution that is going to serve the first billion. It's not necessarily going to cater to the diversity that constitutes humankind today. And again, the levers of control are going to reside in very, very few hands. And you were someone who actually took on the monopolistic construct of this industry earlier on. Are you worried about AI?
Well, I think the big risk of AI is that it takes our human biases, prejudices, and entrenches that deeply in all the systems that we then rely on. And this is why this moment is so crucial as to what kind of data do you use when you train? What is your demand in making sure that your algorithm, when you sort out applications for university, or whether you can get a mortgage, or whether you can rent an apartment, that these are actually fair, non-biased when it comes to the diversity of people. And the crucial point in that is now. And I think it's really important, no matter what kind of push one can give to the technologies who are the developers and the users of some of these systems, that be codes of conduct, that be orders, that be legislation, that everyone realizes that the point is now. Because otherwise we may slip into a future where human prejudice are just being so much present in how people are being treated.
And I'll just come back to you later, but I want you to think about how do labs that churn out these fantastic new innovations get a sense and context of countries in Africa and Asia, and how does innovation respond to that? I'll come back to you on that in a way of a solutions framework. Prime Minister Harper, let me turn to you. In many ways, you epitomized the Atlantic order, the liberal order that Megan was referring to. You had you as one of the tallest leaders at that particular moment. What went wrong? What can be done to come up with a new version that works for all? Or is it time for a brand new framework, a new original design that reflects today's age?
Well, I think a lot of things went wrong, and I'm not sure it's terribly useful to recite them here. What might be more useful is just to look at where we're at and what the big deficiencies are we have in terms of trying to move forward on global cooperation or global common action. I think the first and most important thing to admit to ourselves, and this probably isn't just true in the West, but we talk about the difficulty of getting global cooperation, of integrating global perspectives. Let's take a step back. In most of our countries, we're having a really terrible time integrating perspectives within our own societies. And how many countries are essentially the ruling classes, whether they be political, business, cultural, whatever, seem to be terribly out of step with vast segments of the population. And how many of our countries do people like myself on a particular part of the political and social debate not only disagree with vast numbers of other people, but have trouble even understanding the perspectives they're approaching problems with. So, these are just huge problems of our age.
So are you suggesting the fraying of a national consensus in some of key countries?
Well, look, I'll tell you what I'm suggesting first and foremost, and this is my experience with the global order and international institutions. People talk about how these institutions can be more effective, collaborate better, et cetera. My own experience has been that the best global institutions do not function well without really determined sovereign state leadership and cooperation at the top. In the absence of that, they almost always fail. I give two big examples from my time in public life. I was there during the global financial crisis, and I watched how the then administration of the United States, regardless of what implications it may have had in the causes of the crisis, took the leadership in dealing with it, and to what degree we acted with a global consensus across fiscal questions, monetary questions, international financial regulation, et cetera. Then I looked, I guess I was no longer prime minister, but certainly around the public realm during the pandemic. Now look, the pandemic, in a way, should have been a better laboratory for cooperation than a financial crisis. We were very differentially affected. Pandemic affects everybody the same. And yet there was literally no international cooperation. But if you look at it carefully in our own societies, between various levels of government and segments within our societies, there was little cooperation. So I think this problem of non-cooperative behavior is more deeply rooted in the kind of technological and other challenges that we're now facing. I don't have easy answers to them, but I think the first and most important part of it is understanding that different people in different countries have radically different perspectives and priorities. And unless we're prepared to understand and respect them, we're not going to get anywhere on deeper questions of cooperation.
And what about the whole idea that the strong, perhaps rigid relationships of the past that defined the liberal order, the key architects of the liberal order, may no longer be the basis of any new coalitions that may be useful, nimble, and perhaps even efficient today?
Yeah, look, I just think that's a growing reality. I'll be really clear, Samir, in saying I don't like it. I think that if you look at the sweep of world history, the period where we had a unipolar or quasi-unipolar American-led order was the one period in history where we have had something resembling a rules-based order. I think at all other times we tend to devolve towards essentially the strongest rule, and the kind of coalitions to develop are narrow, and they're narrow regionally, and they're narrow in terms of their issue set, and they're narrow in terms of what they can achieve. So I'm not celebrating that change, but I agree it's real. And I would agree, what I would say is this: when you talk about, and so many do, the terms global north and global south, what do we really mean by that? I tend to, when I think of the north, I tend to think of the west, because it's really just the west plus Russia and a couple of countries. What's the difference between that, the west, and the global south? The real difference is, in a sense, the people who were involved in constructing the order. And those people, regardless of a range of different economic, security, and values perspectives, were the people who were outside of that order and are now struggling to get their perspectives and views in. As I say, I don't think we're going to find it in the absence of a single, reasonably benevolent world leadership. I don't think we're going to find it very easy to reconstruct a new order, but that is the reality we're now seized with.
So let me turn to you, Minister Jaishankar. Pax Americana, as Prime Minister Harper was alluding to, was perhaps that time when a semblance of a rules-based order existed, and it was because it was based on certain defined and rigid relationships. Is that the only way for the world in the future? Would we eventually have to arrive at a state where you would have a club with the rules and with the articles of charter of association?
No. No meaning, I think, like everything else, it had its moment or period in history, and history moved on, and the global order moves on. And I think what Prime Minister Harper also suggested is, for long periods of history, you had limited order or a kind of a non-orders at times. So what we may well, one day we may well say that what we saw after 1945 was a very unusual period of global politics. But having said that, why is it not easily extrapolatable in a way? Look, today the divides are really deep, okay? And the architecture at a certain level is really frozen, it's rigid. Okay. The guys at the top are not making space. There's a big push from the middle, upper middle, there's a push from the bottom, upper bottom. So you actually are moving more and more into an era where people say, I'm never going to get everybody in this room to agree to work together. So I'll go to that sofa, find those 5, 6 nice people who agree with me, and we will proceed to work on what we want to work on. And, I was doing some research on the Quad, and then I came on a very interesting number. I tried to figure out in the last 10 years, how many of these small groupings India had joined. Last 10 years. I could discover 36 in different domains, okay? From security, maritime, to economic, trade, energy. So my sense is we are moving to a much sort of looser order where there isn't a CPU, there isn't a kind of
a diktat from a...
There isn't a rigidity to it. And that's part of what you yourself said. I mean, you used the word middle power, new power. So when you have more variables, more access, less overarching discipline, you will get to a very, very different situation.
You just mentioned get people in the room. Now, look, there are some in this part of the world who see you getting into many rooms with President Putin, with Macron, with everyone in the Middle East.
Key.
So I mean, that was Meghan's hidden complaint there, that you speak to everyone, and I think that's what Prince Faisal mentioned as well. So the serious question to you here is it important to have these hubs where different groupings could actually try and find solutions that may be optimal for all of us?
Yes. I would give you the example of G20. What we had, and I'm sure you would bear with me here, we had essentially about 10 or 11 members who had very strong views of a certain kind. So you had the G7, Korea, Australia, EU, etc. Then you had Russia at the other extreme. And on many issues, China was very supportive of Russia. And then you had countries like us out there in the middle. Okay. And if you look really I mean, it was less apparent in Bali, certainly in the Delhi G20 summit. I think when we were to eventually get everybody around the table and find some kind of common ground. And the common ground was not just on geopolitical, it wasn't just an Ukraine debate. There were big debates about the digital public infrastructure, whether in fact G20 should be endorsing it at all, or a debate whether we should be open about the fact that there's been an enormous regression in achieving SDG goals, or the fact that unless there is more credible funding from international financial institutions, this talk about climate action is bogus. So in a lot of this, you actually had those 6-7 countries who worked together, supported each other, did the bridging role. I mean, obviously, as we were the hosts, we had a lead in that process. So I'm citing that to you as just one example. But I do think there will be, if you pick a field, I can show you why there's a credible case for multiple combinations. We've, again, at the G20, one of the big achievements was the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. And that involved India, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and a bunch of European countries, and of course the United States. But at the same time, the nature of life and politics being what it is, you're going to have other corridors. So we have an international north-south transport corridor as well, which involves Iran, Azerbaijan, Russia, and somebody else up there. So the point I'm making is the idea that there is one truth, there is one way, there is one solution. That era is over. The world is returning to its natural diversity. If there are 290 whatever countries in the world, you cannot impose a single thought or a single sort of discipline on them. I think that the natural world was far more consultative and diverse. We are returning to where we should have a long time ago.
Prince Faisal, I could see you nodding. Do you want to come in on this?
I'm nodding because I agree. I agree on, first of all, the last point, which is that it is probably the natural order if you look at the broad sweep of history. But I also agree that, and I think that's what Jayshenko was saying, that in the end, what will drive us, or what should drive us, is the search for a win-win environment where everybody can move forward and everybody's interests can be taken into account. I think one of the challenges with the previous order, with the unipolar order, was that the interests of some were always prioritized over the interests of others. And part of that was because of where we were individually in our developmental journeys. But as we move forward, countries like India, countries like the Kingdom and others, where we now have legitimate aspirations to be part of the first world or whatever you want to call it, then there's a necessity to build those partnerships and build those conversations in a way that allows everybody to partake in the interests of the future. And we won't achieve the big challenge, addressing the big challenges without cooperation. And that cooperation will more likely come from a drive by those middle powers, or whatever you call them, the aspiring nations that are moving into the future, like the kingdom, like India and others, who will force the conversation into the direction of cooperation. And the digital divide or the digital spectrum is one of those areas, because obviously we are investing heavily in advanced technologies, including AI. And we are very, very interested in making sure that the conversation goes in a direction where there's an equal playing field, where we avoid that eventuality that you alluded to, that there is a capture through regulatory frameworks or other mechanisms in certain spaces. So I think for the vast majority of the population of the planet, this new dynamic actually will end up being beneficial because it will be a leveler and make sure that prosperity goes in a more equal way throughout the world.
Thank you, Prince Faisal. But let me remind you that you are also noticed in many rooms. I'm just telling you, like the foreign minister here. Ms. Vestager, you wanted to come in. I could see you.
No, it's just, the thing that worries me about this talk about the natural order is that in the natural order, the strongest always win. So I would ask for a more sort of cultural order. Because we cannot have, well, first of all, it's not order. It's just the strongest who flexes the muscle, and there we are. What would be, in my view, ideal is to see how can we forge a path where it's the priority for every nation state to increase the welfare of citizens, coming from the starting point that it's the integrity and the dignity of every person that is the source of legitimacy. And that can be done in many different ways, and that can be done by tiny states and big nations. My point is to say that we need to find a way as to how can we cooperate in different functions. Because if we do not solve climate change, we're in for much bigger problems than what we have right now. And if we do not use technology as an equalizer in doing so, we will not be successful. I simply do not think that it is possible, because then that natural disorder of the strongest have the biggest might will just be underpinned by technology that can be used very effectively.
Megan, you wanted to come in?
I did. I wanted to just reflect on the conversation. I think on the one hand, it all sounds quite seamless and agreeable that we would have different coalitions of...
I haven't noticed any agreement on this panel yet.
Okay.
I'm just telling you, you're very polite, but you're not agreeable.
Okay. Well, I'm finding this vision of fluid coalitions addressing multiple problems at different periods of time. That all sounds good, and I'm sure that'll be part of the system, but we're leaving out two really important things. This is one happening in a dynamic of great power competition, which cannot be divorced from this conversation when we're talking about the kinds of global problems that are going to arise. The possibility of a great power conflict, which could upend this entire emerging order. And the second thing that we haven't talked so much about, although you just addressed it here, is how does this fluid coalition actually solve global problems? I can see how fluid coalitions can address particular issues for particular regions, particular areas, but when we have existential global problems, how
like
are
the
these
pandemic,
flowed?
The pandemic, as Prime Minister Harper
like the
mentioned.
pandemic,
the old order didn't do too well
Right,
either.
and would this order actually do any better with the pandemic?
I think that's a fair question. That are you going to improve it? Are you going to regression? I could see a glint in your eyes, so I'll let me come to you.
No, I think this was the moment you're waiting for us to disagree. I want to disagree with both of them on different aspects of what they said. I don't think a natural order is a winner. It's the fittest will survive. It doesn't have to be. It's not necessarily a winner-take-all combinations. And I look at parts of the world where actually different cultures and diversity and pluralism has survived. It may have its tensions and problems, but nobody imposed. Take us, for example, currently at 1.4 billion, but if you take the subcontinent as a whole, probably closer to 2 billion. Nobody imposed a single language. Nobody imposed a single ethnicity or social characteristic. So there was some ability to find an equilibrium among different sets of people. So this idea that the natural order was a winner-take-all, I would actually suggest is either a very East Asian construct or a very Western construct. I think
That's called great power competition.
No, I'll come to that. That was my second point of agreement. Great power competition is not so bad. Let me tell you what's really bad. Great power collaboration. The rest of us get squeezed out. So I think, it's important, especially for the rest of the world, that the big guys don't gang up on everybody else and settle problems over their heads. And that's happened to us. Not just us. I think it's happened to large parts of the world. So I think this is very healthy. If there are today differences in economics, in sociology, in political culture, in approach to international relations, we shouldn't pretend we agree when we don't. I think rest of us get to take positions somewhere in between, and the world is so much better off for it.
Prime Minister Apo, you want to come in?
I must admit, I'm sort of closer in view to.
Do you want to change chairs?
To our two lady friends on this. I do worry. I think it's a reality, but I do worry that this, so-called natural order we're returning to, will be inevitably more chaotic, more unfair, and less collaborative than we would like. And in that kind of an order, multiple realities can exist at the same time. Let me just, let's jump back into history, because we talk about the unipolar world as being an aberration. Let's talk about a period we think about as a relatively stable kind of natural order, or what you want to call it, great power collaboration. And I think about the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and World War I, possible exception of the Franco-Prussian War, a period of where the major powers of the world largely avoided catastrophic conflict. On the other hand, the other reality was a period of the most comprehensive and probably rapacious colonialism in human history that went on at the same time. So I just think as we enter this world, we can't just assume that because power is becoming more diffuse, that it's becoming fair. In the case of countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, tremendous economic wealth and vision they can bring to bear on a range of problems. India, important simply because of its size, but also other great attributes. And so countries like these, pushing themselves more into the dialogue in front of the table, getting different priorities addressed. But I think of the vast majority of Africa, which is utterly neglected by almost all major powers and all major institutions. So we're really going to have to, if we really want this kind of more complex order to be fair and collaborative, we're going to have to make real efforts to make it so.
Prince Faisal.
I think one thing that history probably teaches us is nothing is perfect and nothing is entirely right or entirely wrong. And all systems have their deficiencies. It's up to us to make them work. So if we are moving into a multipolar order or a more diffuse order, it will be a responsibility for all of us to make sure that it serves the interests of all. And that will be up to us. But the challenges of a unipolar order are significant, were already explained, so I won't have to go into them. And when it goes to something like Africa, as an example, Africa was very much ignored for the last 30, 40 years. But if you look at what we in the kingdom, for instance, are doing, and even what's happening between India and Africa, between the middle powers of the world and their outreach to Africa and their investment in Africa, it's quite significant. And we are coming at it, without the colonial baggage, but also without an agenda. Our agenda when we invest in Africa is to be successful with each other. And that's why, for instance, the kingdom is one of the largest investors in renewable energy in the African continent by far. well beyond what all of those countries that have stated a strong commitment to tackling climate change have done. And when we had the Paris Agreement and this commitment to $100 billion never came up. We made a decision to do on a business basis what everybody failed to do, because we believe that a transition into this new energy future needs to be uniform and needs to be everywhere. So again, I think that we understand better the challenges and the needs of our community, and that's why we will work to make sure that the deficiencies are addressed, and they are addressed collaboratively. But the old order didn't work so well. That's just my point.
So let me take a couple of questions from those who've joined us for lunch. I want to bring Vera in, and then maybe Bharat, do you want to come in as well? Where is Bharat? Yeah, let's bring Bharat in. So let's start with Vera. Let's go to Bharat, and then we'll come back to you. So Vera.
Thank you, Samir, and thanks to the panel. Pleasure to see you, Minister J. Shankar. I think two things that we're talking about, and you did mention it. I think the inclusion, of course, of Africa in the G20 begins to do this more multipolar world, and very important. The second thing, and we've been discussing this, and it's great that we've seen some hesitation, is this sort of global south, global north business. I think we've now agreed that we don't like that term, and we should maybe find something new. I have let Ravi take that conversation. My sense is, we saw with climate change, and I fully agree with you, it's an existential threat, a little bit of a throwing out of sort of the Bretton Woods consensus, right? We all grew up in private sector, no subsidies, no all of this. And then that went out the window. And nobody seemed to protest a little bit. On the contrary, what happened is the Europeans said, oh, you have the IRA, we're going to do something too. And I think that is the multipolar world that is emerging, right? We're saying we do need to find different solutions and different options. And we have to continue down that road, because we are certainly not going to always agree on everything. I take, for example, African continent, 2.2 trillion GDP, India, 2.5 trillion GDP. A vote comes up in the UN, we vote the same way. We get excluded from everything. India continues to be talked to. Why? Not clear to us about how some of those conversations happen. And I think the only way then that we continue to exist is that we get into a G20 or a G21. But I'd like to maybe get your views on some of this sort of, how geopolitics translates into economics and down into climate and
So the
digital.
utter neglect
Thank
of
you.
Africa from what lies ahead. I think that's a fair question to ask. Jane, can I come to you?
Well, I think we can all agree that Samir talks faster than any other human being on the planet. And I just had a wonderful experience with him in Davos. My question is about something that wasn't mentioned at all, nuclear weapons. Some countries have them, others don't. Some countries are trying to get them, others can't. Doesn't that distort any progress, whether it's multipolar, unipolar, non-polar, or whatever?
Let me also bring Natalie in. Natalie.
So you kind of, Minister Jaishankar, you talked about the multiple divisions within the G20. And I thought it was very interesting the way in which you highlighted the fact that this was not only about Ukraine, it was about the SDGs, it was about climate. And indeed, I think, it really sort of points to the fact that the world is both more integrated, but also more fractured. It's both multipolar, but also non-polar. And I'm wondering, in terms of the effects on order that this has, does it mean that there is greater traction behind those organizations that reflect one grouping or another, as opposed to those that try to bring sort of those divides together? I mean, I think during your G20 presidency, you did an amazing job at actually holding it together. But it is very clear, on the other hand, that it seems that there are other groupings, whether it's the Quad, whether it's the BRICS, whether it's the G7, that reflect, in a sense, a certain cohesion that really seem to have more, in a sense, wind behind their sails.
Lydia, you want to come in? Short and sharp.
It was just a question regarding the American perspective, which I'm quite familiar with. I wonder if perhaps we don't think about the fourth industrial revolution and how that changes everything. And so I'd like to put the question back to say, perhaps it's a bit arrogant to continue to imagine the world through great power competition when we've moved forward.
Thank you. And the final question, and then I'll come back to the panelists. I hope some of you are taking notes because I have forgotten all of them.
Thank you very much. My name is Bharat Ramanan, and I'm Director for Geopolitical Analysis at DP World. Minister Jaishankar, I just wanted to ask you, what role can India play in bridging this divide between the global south and the north? And if you don't mind peppering your answer with examples from your fascinating book, which I recommend everybody buy.
I didn't ask him to say that.
Look, let me make a pitch for Raisina. We are going to have a big discussion around his book at the end of Raisina Dialogue. So those of you who can catch a flight and come to Delhi, we'll discuss his book. But we'll still give you a chance to respond briefly to a rather expansive question asked. But let me, as we close this panel, and I'm going to come to you for your final comments at this stage, let me ask you all again, that as we started, I asked you, can we come up with some tangible next steps to work together better, to make it better? And what could be one or two easy things to do as we look to use this moment and shape a new framework for the future rather than despair in what's already withered away. And to see this as the beginning rather than Armageddon. For us, it's the rebirth and the restart of a new order, and use it as that moment. What could be one or two practical advice from your vantage points on the world should be thinking about to make it happen? So let me start with you, Megan. We started with you. Let me come to you also for the final.
Sure. Thank you. So let me respond to a couple of things that were saying.
Go ahead.
So first on this, isn't it arrogant to assume the world through the eyes of great power competition when we've moved beyond that? I would just say, I started out the panel by saying I saw two big dynamics in the international system. One was great power competition. The other was this rise of these middle powers. I think I would love a world where we've risen beyond great power competition, but I think the facts don't suggest we are there. And the reality is that it does affect everyone else. And I think we need to be acutely aware of that, both in terms of how we conduct this great power competition and the stakes at hand. And I'll just give an example by referring to what Vera said about the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act, which is oddly named, but is the biggest piece of American climate legislation ever made, that was a product of great power competition. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would have never happened in the absence of the United States and China being deeply, deeply competitive with one another.
I told you it was a good thing.
Well, it can be a good thing. It's competition and not conflict, right? And the question is how to thread that needle. So I think that it would be naive to think that we've moved to a period where that's no longer a dynamic. And as an American or as anyone, I think not taking some responsibility for that and acknowledging it, and it would be misleading. Just on what we can do, you said a few easy things. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear. I'll do one non-easy thing, but one that could be effective. I do think there is an imperative and an opportunity for how we work together, whatever names we want to give, global north, global south, on climate change, particularly when it comes to the developing world. And when we talk about climate finance, and this has come up on a couple of occasions in this panel, that working to figure out collectively, collaboratively, how the global south can actually develop in a way that it becomes part of the clean energy supply chains, rather than just, we want to provide more climate finance so you can buy more products from Europe and the West. This is more, how can we invest in these countries so that they can develop in a way.
The green transitions.
Yeah.
So IRA for the world. Let's think about that. Prime Minister Harper.
I'm not sure I have a really quick answer to...
Any responses? Africa?
Yeah, I do. Look, I think all of these big issues, climate change, global economic challenges, global peace and security, frankly, the retreat of democracy, the dysfunction within democratic societies, I think these are all huge things. And I think the first thing to fixing them or dealing with them is to stop pretending they're easy. None of these things have easy solutions. But I'm going to go to Jane's point because I think it is the single most the issue that we are paying the least attention to, that has the absolutely worst and most immediate implications, and that has been the progressive proliferation of nuclear weapons and potentially more in the coming years. We have increasingly dangerous people with nuclear weapons capability or the potential of achieving it. And surely this is something that from the littlest powers to the greatest powers, it is all in our interest to deal with and to preclude really bad outcomes as fast as we can.
Thank you, Prime Minister Harper. I'm sure you're not referring to the United States when you mentioned dangerous people with nuclear weapons. Vice President.
Well, thank you. If we agree that one needs to look at complex problems in a complex manner, my suggestion would be to renew our language. Because the language is inviting us to see the world in a polarized manner. For me, Global South make no sense, none whatsoever. Global North, non plus. So also this idea that you can have big, medium, small, I think it's just a return to something that we tried to get rid of, which was first, second, third world, which made no sense either. And again, if I may return to my initial point, technology is a big equalizer. Because it enables nations to do things that would otherwise have taken decade after decade after decade. It enables, the extraction of corruption in your systems when you use digital tools for trade. You can provide health services for so many more people. You can provide financial services for so many more people. But my first suggestion would be to reinvent the language in which we speak about the world, because I think it's really not helping us. And I also think it's not helping us in how we include countries on the African continent so much more. Because for me, it doesn't make any sense either to speak about Africa. It's countries. It's so much more. There's so much more potential. There are so many differences there. And we do not grasp it if we do not take that on board. And then we need to look further, and that would be my second suggestion, as to how we reform our international financial order. Because it goes back to a time where things were very different, and it does not serve us well today. And that, I think, would help us do a number of the things that we would want to do, and also be more equalizing.
Prince Faisal, may I turn to you?
I think, first of all good ideas that have been put forward so far. And honestly, I don't have anything better to add, except I think the one thing that could drive us into a better future, if we were all more honest with each other, and if we were all more transparent about what we really wanted. Because too much foreign policy and too much relations is about artifice and not about reality.
Fair enough. Let's get real. Sir.
Okay, so I pick up on the honesty and transparency point and proceed to therefore voice a number of different views. First of all, Global South. It's interesting. I found we did a Voice of the Global South Summit about a year ago. We did it again a few months ago. When I travel around the world, there is a body of opinion which is very questioning of the Global South. They want a legalistic definition, historical definition, whatever. There is a wide body of opinion which knows exactly what you're talking about. You don't need to explain to them what Global South is about. As you say, if you have it there, you know your Global South. If you don't have it, you will continue to question it. Now, that issue of, is it a dividing terminology? Life is differentiated. This is a little bit like globalization, where we pretended that everybody was benefiting from globalization significantly, whereas some benefited hugely, some benefited less, and some actually ended up as victims of globalization. So I would say it's important, if there is today a basis for a category of societies who believe for historical reasons they have had a very difficult time, who today are struggling with issues like SDGs, who climate action, who were on the wrong side of the divide when it came to COVID. I think if you ask these countries, so guys, do you know what Global South is? I assure you all of them do. Now, on Africa's membership, again, I mentioned that. You know, it's interesting. I've been doing G20s since 2015. Antalya was my first exposure. I've seen that issue rolled over G20 by G20, including the last time at Bali when we were there. It was supposed to be addressed. It didn't get addressed. This time, we were very determined. We're not going to let it become part of the end game and then meet the same fate as it did 10 years, for 10 years, or maybe longer. So what essentially Prime Minister Modi did was he essentially wrote to the others saying, I think it's a splendid idea to make them a member. Please tell me, I mean, he didn't say this in as many words, but please tell me if you disagree. Now, nobody's going to disagree. So I think it was necessary to force that issue. And today, you know, a lot of these interests, yes, we will debate it, we will differ about it, but you're not going to get change unless, in a way, you force it. The question about small groups and G20. You know, G20 by nature is more amorphous. I mean, they have different roles. Being in, you know, a Quad is not less valid or more because there is a G20. Quad has a purpose, G20 has a purpose, some other groups have their purpose. So it is a world of multiple realities and multiple purposes.
Sir, when you are part of 36 small groups, every morning do you get a charter of each of them that this is what we... I'm just asking, like...
You play by instinct. No, but let me come to the nuclear issue. You know, it's interesting you asked that question. About 45 years ago, I did a PhD on broadly this subject. And I'll tell you a very interesting thing. 45 years ago, who were the nuclear concerns? You know, look back at the literature of the 1960s and 70s. People were convinced Germany would make weapons, Japan would make weapons, South Africa, I mean India, Pakistan, not Pakistan, India, Pakistan not on the radar, Israel, South Africa, Sweden, some people said Switzerland. These were countries who actually had nuclear programs of various kinds. Now, it's very interesting when we think of proliferation, we put it in a box by itself. One of the reasons why there has been proliferation is the US particularly, but the Soviet Union as well. They dissuaded many countries from exercising the nuclear option through political incentives. So what we today describe as a breakdown of the non-proliferation order is actually a breakdown of the political accompaniment. You know, diplomacy failed us, which is why we have ended up with this situation. So I would come back finally to plug our collective business, which is at the end of the day, don't underrate diplomacy. It is a solution to many problems. Life is tough. There will be many things happening. But at the end of the day, I think we need to be optimistic about where we are going. And for all the complexities that we discuss, finally, small circles, medium circles, big circles, you need a circle.
Circles are important. The size can continue to expand as challenges emerge. But thank you very much for your interventions. Please join me in applauding this wonderful panel for their time this afternoon. And I hope to see many of you in Delhi next week. So safe travels.